The lights on the Galactic Council chamber floor glowed an angry red, like blood seeping from a mortal wound, as Ambassador Vega's scheme to betray humanity was set in inexorable motion. The human delegation could only watch, stunned and powerless, as the Council voted to expel Earth, stripping away the protectorate status that had safeguarded humanity's homeworld for generations. Vega, the manipulative Zarantine politician behind this outrage, allowed himself a thin, cruel smile. His web of lies about illegal human AI research had ensnared the Council, and now the true objective was within his grasp: unrestricted access to Earth and its priceless reserves of xerinium, the rare mineral vital for advanced spaceship propulsion. Vega's fleet lay poised at the border of human space, ready to strike the moment Earth became fair game. But the Zarantine had badly underestimated human resolve. On the bridge of the Terran flagship, a grim-faced Admiral Brian Robinson watched the Council vote unfold, his fury building with every treacherous tally. This vile farce would not stand. The Admiral vowed to rally Earth's forces, expose the truth of the Zarantine scheme, and defend humanity's rightful place among the stars, whatever the cost. Brian knew that far more than Earth's mineral wealth was at stake in this crisis. The Council's betrayal was a virtual declaration of war, leaving the human race itself vulnerable to conquest and slavery. The survival of billions now hung on the actions of Brian and his fleet in the coming days. They were the last line of defense. As the Zarantine invasion force advanced, Brian worked feverishly to fortify the solar system and mobilize every ship he could muster. Stealth vessels raced through the wormhole network, carrying desperate appeals for aid to the few races still sympathetic to Earth's plight. It was a dangerous gamble. The Zarantine had spies everywhere. The enemy's numbers and technology were formidable, yet Brian held an unshakable faith in his people's courage and tenacity. The men and women of the Terran fleet were highly skilled and motivated. They would make the Zarantine pay dearly for every inch of space. And Brian had a plan. An audacious bid to expose the Zarantine's illegal activities and the Council's corruption that just might shift the balance. The forces were arrayed, the stage set for a battle that would decide humanity's fate. On the flagship's bridge, Brian watched the scopes, tracking the incoming enemy fleet. This would be the crucible of his career, a test of all his abilities and resolve, with the lives of billions in his hands. Yet Brian's heart held no fear, only a cold, implacable determination, as unbreakable as the armored hull of his ship. The Terran fleet was ready. Let the Zarantine and their council lackeys do their worst. Earth would never fall without a fight. As the Zarantine fleet retreated, Admiral Brian Robinson wasted no time in implementing his desperate plan. He turned to his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Thompson. "Sarah, prep the Phantom for immediate departure. Commander Mitchell and his crew need to leave now." "Aye, sir," Sarah responded, her fingers already dancing across the console. In the hangar bay, Commander Jack Mitchell and his hand-picked crew boarded the Phantom, a sleek black vessel that seemed to melt into the shadows. The ship's state-of-the-art cloaking technology was their best hope of slipping through the enemy lines undetected. As the Phantom launched, Jack felt the weight of his mission settling on his shoulders. The evidence of the Zarantine's treachery, carefully stored in the ship's secure data core, could be the key to turning the tide of this war. Navigating the wormhole network was a delicate dance, requiring precise calculations and split-second timing. The Phantom's pilot, Lieutenant Emily Chen, guided the ship through the twisting corridors of space with a steady hand and nerves of steel. Finally, they emerged in Crodian space. Jack opened a secure channel to Ambassador Zelos, the Crodian diplomat Brian had befriended during his time on the Galactic Council. "Ambassador Zelos, this is Commander Jack Mitchell of the Terran Fleet. I have urgent information that you need to see." Zelos's holographic image flickered to life on the Phantom's bridge. His angular features were etched with concern as Jack presented the evidence of the Zarantine's illegal activities and the Council's corruption. "This is deeply troubling," Zelos said, his voice grave. "I will bring this matter before the Crodian High Council immediately. Earth will not stand alone." Back in the solar system, the battle raged on. The Zarantine fleet, vastly outnumbering the Terran defenders, pressed their attack with relentless fury. Missiles streaked through space, and energy beams crisscrossed the void as ships on both sides traded blows. On the bridge of his flagship, Brian gritted his teeth as another volley of enemy fire rocked the ship. The Terran fleet fought with skill and courage, but they were being steadily pushed back. "Admiral, our shields are at 30%, the tactical officer shouted over the din of battle. Brian knew they couldn't hold out much longer, but he refused to give up. He would fight to the last, buying time for Jack and the Phantom to complete their mission. Just as all seemed lost, a ripple in space heralded the arrival of a new force. A massive wormhole yawned open, and through it poured a fleet of gleaming Crodian warships, led by Ambassador Xelos's flagship. "Admiral Robinson, the Crodian Empire stands with Earth," Xelos declared over the comm. "Let us fight together and bring an end to this injustice." Brian felt a surge of hope as the Crodian ships joined the battle, their advanced weapons cutting through the Zarantine fleet like a scythe through wheat. Together, the Terran and Crodian forces launched a blistering counterattack, hitting the enemy from all sides. Caught between the hammer of the Crodian fleet and the anvil of Earth's defenses, the Zarantine began to crumble. Their ships fell back in disarray, and soon a full retreat was underway. On the bridge of the Zarantine flagship, Ambassador Vega hit his fist against the console in frustration. His grand plan was unraveling before his eyes, but he would not accept defeat so easily. "This is only a temporary setback," he snarled to his subordinates. "We will regroup, gather our strength, and return to crush these upstart humans once and for all." As the last of the Zarantine ships fled the solar system, Brian allowed himself a moment of relief. Earth had survived, thanks to the bravery of its defenders and the timely intervention of the Crodians. But Brian knew this was only the beginning. The Zarantine would be back, and the Galactic Council's corruption ran deep. To secure Earth's future, they would need to build a coalition of like-minded species, expose the truth, and bring the guilty to justice. It would be a lengthy and challenging road, but with allies like the Crodians at their side, Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose. Earth would not bow to tyranny or corruption. They would fight for their place among the stars, at any expense. The dust had barely settled from the Zarantine invasion when Admiral Brian Robinson found himself back at work. He hunched over a holographic display in the newly established Joint Command Center, studying troop movements with Ambassador Xelos. "We need to fortify these sectors," Brian said, gesturing to a cluster of systems near the Zarantine border. "They'll strike here first when they regroup." Xelos nodded, his angular features set in concentration. "Agreed. I'll dispatch our cruiser squadrons to reinforce the area." Brian straightened, rubbing his tired eyes. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity as they scrambled to solidify their alliance and prepare for the next Zarantine assault. But there was more to be done. "I'm heading out on a diplomatic tour," Brian announced. "We need more allies if we're going to stand a chance against the Zarantine in the long run." Brian's diplomatic mission took him across the galaxy. On the desert world of Tyrixia, he addressed the Planetary Council, presenting damning evidence of the Zarantine's illegal activities. "The Galactic Council has turned a blind eye to corruption for too long," Brian declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Join us, and together we can build a more just galaxy." The Tyrixian delegates murmured among themselves. Then their leader stood. "We have suffered under the Council's unfair trade policies for generations. Tyrixia stands with Earth and Crodia." Similar scenes played out on world after world, but even as the coalition grew, trouble brewed within. Brian was jolted awake by a priority alert. "Admiral, you need to see this," his XO said grimly. In the command center, Brian watched security footage of an Earth frigate exploding in its dock. "Sabotage," he growled. "This is the third incident this week." "Sir, it gets worse," his intelligence officer reported. "We've lost contact with the supply convoy to Outpost Sigma, and half the pulse cannons on Titan base just went offline due to a software glitch." Brian's fists clenched. "The Zarantine must have agents in our ranks. We need to root them out now." He assembled a crack team of Earth and Crodian operatives, led by his most trusted officers. They pored over comm logs, set up surveillance, and ran sting operations across the Alliance. After weeks of investigation, Brian's team made a breakthrough. They cornered a saboteur in the act of planting explosives on a Crodian cruiser, but when they unmasked the culprit, it wasn't a Zarantine agent. It was a Crodian. Brian stared at the footage in disbelief. He immediately contacted Zelos for an emergency meeting. "I don't understand," Zelos said, his normally composed demeanor shaken. "Why would my own people do this?" Brian played the saboteur's confession. The Crodian extremist ranted about how the Alliance was holding their species back, how they should use the stolen Zarantine tech to dominate the galaxy instead of helping inferior humans. Zelos slumped in his chair, looking older than Brian had ever seen him. I am ashamed, my friend. I had no idea such sentiments existed among my people." Brian clasped Zelos's shoulder. "This isn't your fault, but we need to deal with these extremists before they tear our alliance apart." Together, they planned a series of lightning raids on suspected extremist hideouts. Brian led a strike team onto a Crodian space station that had gone dark. They fought their way through twisting corridors, exchanging fire with the extremists. "Clear!" Brian shouted as they secured the command center. But their leader, a warlord named Malik, had already fled. Zelos's team hit a hidden base on a Crodian moon. They captured dozens of extremists and a treasure trove of intelligence, but it revealed an even greater threat. "Malik's been in contact with Vega," Zelos reported. "The Zarantine are supplying him with advanced weapons." Brian's blood ran cold. If the Zarantine allied with these extremists, it could destroy everything they'd built. They had to take out Malik, fast. They hatched a plan, leaking info about a vulnerable supply convoy. When Malik took the bait, Brian and Zelos were waiting with a massive fleet. The battle was fierce. Malik's ships, jam-packed with Zarantine weaponry, tore into the Alliance fleet. For a moment, it looked like they might be overwhelmed. Then a new wormhole opened, disgorging a Zarantine battle group. Brian cursed. They'd walked into a trap. But Brian and Zelos rallied their forces. They fought with every ounce of skill and courage they possessed, coordinating their attacks with pinpoint precision. Slowly the tide turned. Malik's flagship exploded in a brilliant fireball. The remaining extremists surrendered. The dust had barely settled from the battle with the extremists when Admiral Brian Robinson found himself back in the war room, poring over star charts with Ambassador Zelos. The alliance between Earth and Crodia was stronger than ever, but Brian knew they couldn't rest on their laurels. "We need to hit them hard," Brian said, his voice low and intense. "The Zarantine won't stop until we're wiped out. We have to strike first." Zelos nodded, his angular features set in unshakable focus. "Agreed, but where? Their defenses are formidable." Brian's fingers danced across the holographic display, zooming in on a particular system. "Here, Zar Prime, their shipyards." For days they worked tirelessly, analyzing intelligence reports and running simulations. The shipyard orbiting Zar Prime was a juicy target, the heart of the Zarantine war machine. But it was also deep in enemy territory, jam-packed with defenses. Brian assembled his top officers, laying out the plan. "This won't be easy," he warned, "but if we can pull it off, we'll cripple their ability to wage war." He turned to Commander Jack Mitchell, his most trusted subordinate. "Jack, I'm putting you in charge of the strike force. Think you're up for it?" Mitchell's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Always, sir." The day of the attack arrived. Brian stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as the strike force prepared to depart. A mix of Earth's finest ships and sleek Crodian vessels, they represented the best of both species. "Godspeed," Brian murmured, as the fleet vanished into the secret network of wormholes they'd mapped out. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, suddenly, the command center erupted in a flurry of activity as the first reports came in. "Sir, the strike force has engaged the enemy." Brian leaned forward, studying the tactical displays. Mitchell's ships had burst out of nowhere, catching the Zarantine completely off guard. The orbital defense platforms were overwhelmed in minutes. But the Zarantine recovered quickly. Waves of enemy ships poured in from all sides, threatening to engulf the Alliance forces. "Come on, Jack," Brian muttered, feeding real-time intelligence to his friend. "Push through." The battle raged for hours. Brian's heart was in his throat as he watched Alliance ships wink out of existence on his display. But slowly, inexorably, they established a foothold around the shipyard. "They've done it," Zelos exclaimed. "They've broken through." Brian allowed himself a grim smile. Now comes the hard part. On the main viewer, they watched as Mitchell led the boarding action. Marines in powered armor cut through the shipyard's outer hull, fighting their way inside. The Zarantine defenders put up fierce resistance, but they were no match for the Alliance's elite troops. Finally, Mitchell's voice crackled over the comm. "Charge is set. We're bugging out." Moments later, the shipyard erupted in a series of massive explosions. Construction bays and dry docks were torn apart. Billions of credits worth of war material reduced to twisted scrap in an instant. "All ships, retreat," Brian ordered. "Get our people out of there." The Alliance fleet disengaged, slipping away just as Zarantine reinforcements arrived in system. They'd bloodied the enemy's nose, but at a terrible cost. Days later, Brian stood before a sea of faces, humans and Crodians alike. "We've struck a mighty blow against our foes," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But let us never forget those who gave their lives to make it possible." As the names of the fallen scrolled by on a nearby screen, Brian saw the grit hardening in the eyes of those around him. They'd proven they could stand up to the Zarantine. Now, it was time to take the fight to them. But even as Brian and Zelos reached out to potential new allies, reports came in of Zarantine fleet movements. Vega was marshaling his forces, preparing to strike back with everything he had. Brian stared out at the stars, knowing that the real test was yet to come. The fate of Earth, of Crodia, of the entire galaxy hung in the balance, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they came out on top. The stench of burnt circuitry and scorched metal filled the air as Admiral Brian Robinson surveyed the aftermath of the battle for the Orland shipyards. Debris from destroyed ships drifted lazily through space, a grim reminder of the cost of their victory. "Status report," Brian barked, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "We've secured the main docking bays, sir," his XO reported. "Engineering teams are working to get the shipyard systems back online. But—" he hesitated. "Spit it out," Brian said. "Casualties are heavy, sir. We lost nearly a third of our fleet." Brian's eyebrows furrowed. He'd known the price would be steep, but the reality of it still hit him like a punch to the gut. "And Zelos?" "Still in surgery. It's touch and go." Before Brian could respond, alarms blared across the command center. "Sir, multiple contacts dropping out of FTL." Brian's head snapped up. On the main viewer, a swarm of enemy ships materialized. At their center loomed a massive dreadnought, dripping with weapons. "It's Zyrax," Brian growled. "He's not giving up without a fight." The comm crackled to life, and a deep, guttural voice filled the air. "This is Warlord Zyrax of the Vlaxar. Surrender now, and I may allow some of you to live as slaves." Brian's response was swift. "All ships, battle stations. Form up on the shipyards. We hold this position at all costs." The space around Orlan erupted in chaos as the two fleets clashed. Alliance ships, still reeling from the previous battle, struggled to form a cohesive defense. Zyrax's forces pressed their advantage, punching holes in the Allied lines. Brian's flagship shuddered as enemy fire slammed into their shields. "Concentrate fire on their lead cruisers," he ordered. "Don't let them get a foothold." For hours, the battle raged. Ships on both sides were torn apart by savage barrages of energy weapons and missiles. The shipyards themselves became a battleground as Zyrax launched boarding parties, forcing Brian to divert precious resources to repel the attackers. In the midst of the carnage, Brian received a priority transmission. "Sir, it's Commander Booth. We've identified a weakness in Zyrax's dreadnought. Their starboard shield generator is failing." Brian's mind raced, formulating a plan. Booth, take your strike team and hit that generator. I'll create a diversion. Understood, sir. We won't let you down. Brian turned to his weapons officer. Target all batteries on Zyrax's portside defenses. I want everything we've got. The Alliance ships unleashed a devastating barrage, drawing Zyrax's attention. As the massive dreadnought turned to face this new threat, Booth's team struck. Their nimble fighters slipped through the chaos, pummeling the weakened shield generator. We've breached their defenses, Booth reported triumphantly. Brian seized the moment. All ships concentrate fire on that breach. Take that bastard down. The combined firepower of the Alliance fleet tore into Zyrax's flagship. Explosions rippled across its hull as system after system failed. On the main viewer, Brian watched as the massive ship began to list, venting atmosphere and debris. Suddenly, the dreadnought's reactor went critical. The resulting explosion vaporized nearby ships and sent a shockwave rippling through space. As the light faded, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The remaining enemy ships, leaderless and outgunned, began to retreat. Brian slumped in his chair, exhaustion etched on his face. They'd won, but the cost had been enormous. As he looked out at the devastation surrounding them, he knew the war was far from finished. With the Orlan shipyards secured, they had gained a crucial advantage, but Vega and his corrupt allies wouldn't give up easily. Brian straightened, his voice firm as he addressed his battered fleet. Well done, all of you, but we can't rest yet. We've bloodied their nose. Now it's time to press our advantage. Prep all functional ships for immediate deployment. We're taking this fight to the enemy. As his officers scrambled to carry out his orders, Brian's thoughts turned to his wounded friend. He could only hope that Zelos would pull through. They would need every advantage in the battles to come. Admiral Brian Robinson stood on the bridge of his flagship, his eyes fixed on the tactical displays showing the aftermath of their victory at Orlan. The shipyards, once a scene of carnage, now hummed with activity as repair crews worked tirelessly to bring systems back online. Admiral, production is up 200% across all sectors, reported his logistics officer. We're churning out fighters and frigates at an unprecedented rate. Brian nodded, a plan already forming. Good. We need every ship we can get. It's time to take the fight to Zyrax. He called a meeting of his top commanders, laying out a multi-pronged assault strategy. We'll split into strike groups, hitting Zyrax's forces from multiple angles. Commander Booth, I want you to lead a stealth mission deep into enemy territory. Booth leaned forward, studying the star chart. The Draxer system, their central logistics hub. Exactly. Hit it hard, hit it fast, cripple their supply lines. As Booth's team prepared for their mission, Brian led the main fleet in a push towards Drekka Prime, the Vlaxar homeworld. They encountered heavy resistance at every turn. At Novus III, a resource-rich mining world, Brian's forces engaged a Vlaxar defense fleet. Energy beams crisscrossed space as fighters dueled among the larger capital ships. Brian's flagship shuddered as it absorbed a direct hit. Shields holding at 60%, called out the tactical officer. Enemy cruiser breaking formation, trying to flank us. Brian's hands flew across his command console. All batteries, target that cruiser. Fighter squadrons Delta and Echo, form up on me. We're going to punch a hole in their line. His ship surged forward, leading the charge. Weapons fire lit up the void as they tore through the enemy formation. When the smoke cleared, Novus III was theirs. Similar scenes played out across a dozen systems as Brian's forces methodically pushed back Zyrax's troops. But the cost was high. Ships limped back to friendly space for repairs, their hulls scarred and crews exhausted. Then came word of a massive Vlaxar fleet massing in the Hoth system. Brian knew it was a trap, but he also knew they couldn't let this force go unchallenged. All ships prepare for jump, Brian ordered. We're taking the fight to Hoth. They emerged from hyperspace into chaos. Thousands of ships filled local space, energy weapons and missiles crisscrossing between them in a deadly light show. Evasive maneuvers, Brian shouted as his flagship rocked from a near miss. All ships engage at will and deploy the mines. As the battle raged, specially modified drones seeded the area with cloaked explosives. Xyrax's reserve forces, rushing to join the fray, flew right into the trap. Brilliant explosions lit up space as ship after ship succumbed to the hidden minefield. Brian seized the moment. "All ships, press the attack. Don't let up." His fleet surged forward, hammering the disorganized Vlaxar forces from every angle. In the thick of the battle, Brian found himself face to face with Xyrax's massive dreadnought. The two titans exchanged furious broadsides, their shields flaring under the punishment. Brian's ship shook violently as a Vlaxar beam punched through their armor. "Direct hit to engineering," someone shouted. "We're losing power." Brian gritted his teeth. "Divert all remaining power to weapons. Target their reactor shielding. Fire everything we've got." A final, desperate salvo lashed out, striking Xyrax's flagship with pinpoint accuracy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the enemy vessel's hull began to buckle, consumed from within by a chain reaction. As Xyrax's dreadnought tore itself apart, the remaining Vlaxar ships broke ranks and fled. Brian slumped in his chair, exhausted but victorious. "Stand down from battle stations," he ordered. "Begin search and rescue operations for any survivors." As his crew carried out his orders, Brian's mind was already racing ahead. They'd won a great victory today, but he knew the war was nowhere near the end. The Zarantine and their puppets on the Galactic Council would not take this lying down. "Get me a full damage report," Brian said, straightening in his chair, "and prep all functional ships for immediate redeployment. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Admiral Brian Robinson stood on the bridge of his battered flagship, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The remnants of his once proud fleet limped through space, a shadow of their former strength. Alarms blared as damage reports flooded in from every deck. "Status report," Brian barked, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting orders. His XO, Commander Chen, looked up from her console, her face smeared with grime and sweat. "It's bad, sir. We've lost 40% of our fleet. The rest are running on fumes." Brian nodded grimly. "And Vega?" "His forces are regrouping, but they took heavy losses too. Intel suggests he's preparing for a final push." Before Brian could respond, a priority transmission cut through the chaos. It was Zelos, his Crodian ally. "Brian, we've intercepted Zarantine communications. Vega's setting his sights on Gracchus Prime." Brian's blood ran cold. Gracchus Prime, their last remaining shipyard and the backbone of their production capability. If it fell. "We can't let that happen," Brian said, his mind racing. "Order all ships to make for Gracchus. We'll make our stand there." As the battered Alliance fleet limped towards their final bastion, reports poured in from across their territory. World after world fell to Vega's relentless advance. Horrific accounts of entire populations enslaved or massacred filtered through, each one a dagger in Brian's heart. On the bridge of his flagship, Brian watched helplessly as another distress call came in, this time from New Eden, a human colony world. "Please, we need help. The Zarantine ships are—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Brian thumped his hand against his chair. "Damn it! How many more have to die?" Zelos placed a calming hand on his friend's shoulder. "We can't save them all, Brian. We have to focus on what we can do." Brian nodded, steeling himself. "You're right. All ships, increase speed to maximum. We have to reach Gracchus before Vega." Days later, as they approached the Gracchus system, long-range sensors picked up a massive energy signature. Vega's fleet had arrived. "Battle stations!" Brian roared. "All ships form up on me. We stop them here, or we die trying." The two fleets clashed in the void around Gracchus Prime. Energy weapons lashed out, tearing through hulls and vaporizing fighters. Brian's flagship shuddered as it absorbed a direct hit from one of Vega's new weapons, some kind of phase cannon that bypassed their shields entirely. "Evasive maneuvers," Brian ordered. "Concentrate fire on their lead ships. We need to break their formation." For hours, the battle raged. Brian's forces fought with the desperation of those with nowhere left to run, but Vega's technological superiority was telling. One by one, Alliance ships winked out of existence, overwhelmed by the Zarantine onslaught. As Brian watched his fleet crumble around him, he knew their last stand was failing. Vega's forces pushed ever closer to Gracchus Prime, their weapons already pounding the shipyard's outer defenses. "Sir," Chen called out, her voice tight with fear. "Vega's flagship is moving into position. They're preparing to fire their main weapon." Brian stared at the tactical display, watching as Vega's monstrous dreadnought turned its prow towards Gracchus Prime. He knew that when that weapon fired, it would be the end of everything they'd fought for. With victory in his grasp, Vega's voice crackled over the comms, dripping with smug satisfaction. "It's over, Robinson. Surrender now, and I might let some of your people live as slaves." Brian's hands clenched into fists as he surveyed the devastation around him. Their backs were against the wall, their options exhausted, but as long as they drew breath, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Brian's eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display. Time was running out. He turned to his XO, Commander Chen. "Get me a secure channel to Commander Mitchell. Now." Moments later, Mitchell's face appeared on the monitor. Brian spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Jack, I need you to take your stealth task force to the Kalara system. We're going to turn their sun into a weapon." Mitchell's eyes widened. "Sir, that's the only way we survive this. Your ships have the equipment to modify the sun's fusion reactor. Do it." As Mitchell's force slipped away, Brian set the second part of his plan in motion. He turned to his communications officer. "Lieutenant, prepare a data packet. Make it look like we're consolidating everything we have left at Gracchus. Then, accidentally, let it fall into Zarantine hands." Hours passed as Brian waited, tension building on the bridge. Finally, long-range sensors lit up. "Massive energy signatures detected, sir," the sensor officer called out. "It's Vega's fleet. They're advancing on Gracchus." Brian allowed himself a grim smile. "Right into our trap. All ships, maintain emissions control. Let them come to us." The Zarantine Armada approached, a vast array of deadly warships. Their forward scouts probed ahead, searching for Alliance defenses. "Sir," Chen reported, "Vega's fleet is slowing. They're growing suspicious." Brian keyed his comm. "Mitchell's status?" "Ready on your mark, Admiral." Brian took a deep breath. "Execute." In the Kalara system, Mitchell's ships activated their modifications. The star's corona flared, energy building to impossible levels. Then, in a blinding flash, a coherent beam of stellar plasma lanced out across light years of space. The beam struck Vega's fleet from an impossible angle. Ships vaporized instantly, others spun out of control, their hulls warped by the intense heat. "Now!" Brian shouted. "All ships, engage!" The remnants of the Alliance fleet decloaked at point-blank range, weapons already firing. Caught completely off guard, the Zarantine formations disintegrated under the onslaught. Brian's flagship shuddered as it traded fire with Vega's dreadnought. Alarms blared as a Zarantine beam sliced through their armor. "Shields failing!" Chen shouted over the chaos. "We can't take much more of this." Brian gripped his chair, watching as Vega unleashed swarms of killer drones and vortex missiles. "Evasive pattern Delta. Concentrate all fire on their flagship's drive section." His gunners responded, a spread of missiles streaking out. They detonated against Vega's weakened shields, finally punching through. Secondary explosions rippled along the massive ship's hull. "Their engines are down," Chen reported. "They're dead in space." Brian watched as the remaining Zarantine ships began to break formation, fleeing in disarray. He slumped in his chair, exhaustion overtaking him. "Stand down from battle stations," he ordered. "Begin damage assessment and rescue operations." As his crew scrambled to carry out his orders, Brian stared out at the debris-strewn battlefield. They'd won, but at a terrible cost, and he knew in his gut that this was nowhere near the end. Vega would be back, and next time, the fate of everything they held dear would hang in the balance. Admiral Brian Robinson stood on the bridge of his battered flagship, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The remnants of his once proud fleet limped through space, a shadow of their former strength. Alarms blared as damage reports flooded in from every deck. "Status report," Brian barked, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting orders. His XO, Commander Chen, looked up from her console, her face smeared with grime and sweat. "It's bad, sir. We've lost 40% of our fleet. The rest are running on fumes." Brian nodded grimly. "And Vega?" "His forces are regrouping, but they took heavy losses too. Intel suggests he's preparing for a final push." Before Brian could respond, a priority transmission cut through the chaos. It was Zelos, his Crodian ally. "Brian, we've intercepted Zarantine communications. Vega is setting his sights on something big, something that could turn the tide of the war." Brian's blood ran cold. He punched up the intercepted data on his console, his eyes widening as he scanned the fragmented information. "A superweapon," he breathed. "They're calling it the Planet Killer." For months, an uneasy quiet settled over the galaxy. Brian and Zelos scrambled to fortify their remaining strongholds, but the expected Zarantine assault never came. Instead, their fleet seemed to vanish, withdrawing to the farthest reaches of their territory. Brian paced the war room, studying star charts and intelligence reports. "What are they planning?" he muttered. Zelos shook his head, his alien features creased with worry. "Our spies have gone dark. Whatever Vega's up to, he's keeping it under wraps." Then, without warning, the Zarantine struck. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy, entire worlds falling in a matter of hours. Horrific accounts of mass destruction filtered through comm channels. "Sir," a communications officer burst onto the bridge. "We've got a distress call from Altair 4. The main view screen flickered to life, showing a panicked colonial governor. "Please, you have to help us. The Zarantine are here. They've got some kind of—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a blinding flash of light. When the glare faded, all that remained of Altair the 4 was a rapidly expanding cloud of debris. Brian stared at the screen in shock. "My God," he whispered. "They actually built it." In the days that followed, more worlds fell to the Planet Killer's apocalyptic fury. Those that surrendered were subjugated. Those that resisted were obliterated. Brian called an emergency war council. "We have to stop that thing," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "If we don't, there won't be a galaxy left to save." Zelos nodded grimly. "I agree, but how? Our fleets are in tatters, and that monstrosity could vaporize what's left of us in seconds." Brian's eyes narrowed. "We go for the throat. A small team, our best commandos. If we can't destroy it from the outside, we'll have to take it down from within." Commander Ezra Booth stood at attention, his face a mask of iron will. "My team is ready, sir. Just give the word." Brian clasped the man's shoulder. "I won't lie to you, Ezra. This is a one-way trip. But if you succeed—" Booth nodded. "We'll get it done, sir, for all of us." Days later, Booth's stealth shuttle slipped through the Planet Killer's defensive screen. Alarms blared as they touched down in a maintenance bay. "Move," Booth hissed. His team fanned out, taking down Zarantine guards with practiced efficiency. They fought their way to the central computer core, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Booth's hands flew over the alien controls, uploading the virus that would cripple the superweapons targeting systems. "Sir!" one of his men called out. "Enemy reinforcements incoming!" Booth gritted his teeth. "Hold them off. I need more time." The commandos took up defensive positions, their weapons blazing as Zarantine troops poured into the chamber. One by one, Booth's team fell. "Upload complete," Booth shouted. He turned to his last surviving teammate. "Let's go." They ran for their lives, barely making it back to their shuttle. As they blasted away from the Planet Killer, Booth allowed himself a grim smile. "Mission accomplished," he said softly. Aboard his flagship, Brian received Booth's transmission. "The virus is in place," he said to Zelos. "It's now or never." Zelos nodded. I'll signal our fleets. May the gods be with us. In a blinding flash of light, the combined human-Crodian armada dropped out of hyperspace, surrounding the massive bulk of the planet killer. For a moment, there was silence. Then all hell broke loose. Energy beams lashed out from 1,000 Alliance ships, hammering the planet killer's shields. Fighter squadrons swarmed around the colossal station, probing for weaknesses. "Concentrate fire on their weapon emplacements," Brian shouted. "We can't let that thing get off a shot." His ship rocked violently as Zarantine warships counterattacked. Vega's voice crackled over the comms, dripping with fury. "You dare?" the Zarantine commander snarled. "I'll reduce your precious homeworlds to ash." Brian ignored the threats, focusing on the battle at hand. "All ships, press the attack. We finish this here and now." The space around the planet killer became a maelstrom of destruction. Alliance ships exploded by the dozens, but still they pressed on, pouring fire into the massive station. Brian's flagship shuddered as it absorbed a direct hit from one of Vega's new weapons. Sparks showered the bridge as systems overloaded. "Hull breach on decks 4 through 7, Chen shouted. "We're losing power." Brian gripped his chair, watching as the planet killer's shields began to flicker. "Keep firing!" he roared. "Everything we've got!" In the midst of the chaos, a small group of fighters slipped through a gap in the planet killer's defenses. Led by the last of Booth's commandos, they streaked towards a vulnerable spot in the station's armor. "This is for Earth," the lead pilot whispered. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a barrage of torpedoes. The projectiles struck home, piercing deep into the planet killer's hull. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a silent flash that lit up half the system, the planet killer tore itself apart. The shockwave swept outward, battering the surviving ships of both fleets. As the light faded, Brian sagged in his chair, exhaustion overtaking him. Around the shattered remains of the planet killer, Zarantine ships were already turning to flee. "We did it," Chen breathed, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." Brian nodded, allowing himself a moment of relief. But even as the rest of his crew celebrated, his mind was already racing ahead. They'd won a great victory today, but he knew the war was a long way to go. The Zarantine would be back, and next time... The acrid stench of burning circuitry filled the air as Zelo stumbled through the wreckage of his command center. Alarms blared, their shrill cries a constant reminder of the devastation wrought by the Zarantine's latest assault. He coughed, his lungs struggling against the smoky haze. "Status report," he rasped, clutching a nearby console for support. A young officer, her face smeared with grime, looked up from her flickering display. "Sir, we've lost contact with the Crodian colonies in the Epsilon sector. The bioweapon, it's spreading faster than we can contain it." Zelos closed his eyes, the weight of millions of lives lost, crushing down upon him. He could almost hear the screams of his people, their bodies ravaged by Vega's monstrous creation. When he opened them again, a cold fury burned in their depths. "And Brian?" he asked, dreading the answer. The officer shook her head. "Still critical, sir. The medical team is doing everything they can, but..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the grim reality unspoken. Zelos nodded, steeling himself against the tide of despair threatening to overwhelm him. "Sir!" another voice called out. "Incoming transmission from the Galactic Council." Zelos straightened, composing himself as best he could. "Put it through." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the smug visage of Counselor Draz, one of Vega's newly installed puppets. The Zarantine's tentacles twitched with barely concealed glee. "Commander Zelos," Draz began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The Council has reviewed the recent, unfortunate events. We are prepared to offer terms for your immediate and unconditional surrender." Zelos's fists clenched at his sides. "Surrender, after what you've done?" Draz's expression hardened. "The alternative is the complete annihilation of your species, Commander. Surely even you can see the futility of further resistance." Without waiting for a response, the counselor continued. "You have 24 standard hours to comply. After that..." He left the threat hanging in the air as the transmission cut off. Zalos turned to his crew, seeing the fear and uncertainty etched on their faces. He took a deep breath, pushing aside his own doubts. "This changes nothing," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "We fight on, not just for ourselves, but for every world Vega would see burn." He strode to the tactical display, bringing up a map of Zarantine space. "It's time we took the fight to them. Prep our stealth ships and notify our deep cover agents. We're going after Vega himself." As his officers scrambled to carry out his orders, Zalos allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They might not have the numbers or the firepower to match the Zarantine fleet for fleet, but they had something Vega could never understand: the unbreakable will to survive. Hours later, Zalos stood in the hangar bay, watching as elite commando teams boarded their sleek black ships. Each soldier's face was a mask of willpower, fully aware of the near-suicidal nature of their mission. A grizzled human veteran approached, snapping a crisp salute. "Strike teams are ready, sir. We'll make those bastards pay." Zalos clasped the man's shoulder. "Good hunting, Captain. May your aim be true." As the last of the ships disappeared into the void, Zalos turned back to the war room. The real work was just beginning. He had a galaxy to save and a monster to bring to justice.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.